started as a product for lighting lamps, but the invention of the electric bulb almost brought a premature end to this nascent industry. However, the advent of the internal combustion engine and the demand for automobiles in the early 20th century pushed this industry to the top to become the most important strategic and economic asset of the 20th century. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about petroleum and the journey it went through towards becoming the most important economic and strategic asset of the 20th century. In 1857, in New Haven, Connecticut, Colonel Edwin Drake met the stockholders of the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. The company claimed a lease on land near Titusville, Pennsylvania, where oil had been gathered from ground-level seepages for medicinal use. The company was hoping to make money selling the oil for lighting, and to this end, they sent Edwin Drake to Titusville to assess the viability of the enterprise. Now, Drake returned with a favorable report, and immediately the stockholders formed a new company called the Seneca Oil Company, sold some stock to Drake, and sent him back to develop the site. Drilling began in May 1858, and on August 27, 1859, after drilling to a depth of 69 feet, Drake finally struck oil. And that was the start of the first commercial exploitation of petroleum. And by July of 1860, the first commercial oil refinery was put into operation. It was in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and initially it was focused on extracting kerosene from the crude oil, and any other byproduct was dumped into the creek. So the first commercial use of petroleum was really the kerosene for lamps. And the discovery in Pennsylvania made Pennsylvania and its surroundings boom towns. So all of a sudden, with Drake's discovery, it was clear that oil, which was very precious, could be obtained in large quantities by drilling wells in the Earth's crust. And everybody then started drilling oil. It started at $20 a barrel. And slowly, as everybody started drilling, the supply started increasing. And by 1860, it had dropped to about $9.6 a barrel. I mean, the supply was so much that you virtually had two guys drilling oil from the same well. Production quadrupled from 500,000 barrels in 1860 to over 2 million in 1861, and the price, as a result, dropped to $2 a barrel. So essentially, the nascent industry was becoming a victim of overproduction and complete chaos. And in 1863, a new individual appeared on the scene who would change the face of American oil over the next several decades. John D. Rockefeller. So John D. Rockefeller built his first oil refinery near Cleveland in 1863, and within 2 years it was the largest refinery in the area. However, his primary concern was that the industry was too chaotic, and he felt strongly that there needed to be some control around production, supply, and marketing. And towards that, he felt that he needed to put together the producing and the marketing companies. Now, Petroleum had 4 key areas of operation. That was production, refining, distribution, and marketing. And John was targeting to combine all these into one. In 1870, Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company, which was based in Ohio. And immediately, he began to buy out his competitors until by 1872, he controlled nearly all the refineries in Cleveland. Now that he controlled most of the refineries in Cleveland, his next target was to lower the transportation cost. There were 3 railway companies operating in Cleveland, and since Rockefeller became the biggest customer, he pushed them to give him a special rate. And subsequently, then he started acquiring pipelines and terminal facilities. And over a period of 9 years, from 1/10 of the refineries, he had 90% of the oil refineries in the United States. So by 1882, Standard Oil was a near monopoly on the oil business in the United States. Meanwhile, outside of the United States, one of the biggest discoveries of oil had been in 1846 in Baku in the Russian Empire. And in the 1870s, Imperial Russia abolished the state monopoly on oil and opened the oil-rich region to private enterprise. And subsequently, several companies developed competing refineries, the most prominent being the one run by Ludwig and Robert Nobel, the brothers of the chemist Alfred Nobel. So while the Nobel brothers came to dominate the Russian oil industry, they were unable to enter the global marketplace due to a lack of transportation infrastructure. And to solve this problem, the Caspian and Black Sea Petroleum Company, or Benito, which was financed by the French branch of the Rothschild family, built a railroad connecting the Caspian and Black Seas, and this allowed for export. The Rothschilds then established extensive storage facilities and eventually bought Benito in 1886. And with the entry of Rothschilds into the oil industry, the focus of Russian oil turned global. But even though they had built transportation infrastructure within Europe, they could not market their oil to the Far East. And that was the problem that they were trying to solve. Meanwhile, in 1878 in London, a gentleman by the name of Marcus Samuel took over his father's import-export business, which included the import of Oriental shells. And on the side, he started handling consignments of kerosene. And subsequently, seeing the profit in the oil industry, he formed a separate company for his oil interests, the Shell Transport and Trading Company. And when they heard of the Shell Trading and Transport Company, the Rothschilds approached Marcus Samuel with their problem. After several trips to Japan and Baku, which is present-day Azerbaijan, Marcus Samuel in 1891 finally figured out the solution to the transportation problem from the Caspian Sea to the Far East. Massive sea-going tankers that could go through the Suez Canal, which had just opened in 1869. And when America's Standard Oil heard of this, they smelled competition and fought tooth and nail to prevent the tankers from going through the Suez Canal on safety grounds. But Marcus Samuel himself designed these ships to meet the strict safety standards of the Suez Canal Company, and subsequently in January 1892, he received permission to ply the ships through the Suez Canal. And this development shook the petroleum market, and overnight it made Marcus Samuel and his brother wealthy individuals. And between 1897 and 1927, the value of Shell rose from 1.8 million to 26 million. There was a third big source of oil, the Dutch Indies. And in 1890, a group of Dutch bankers, businessmen, and colonial administrators formed the Royal Dutch Company for exploitation of oil wells in the Dutch Indies. The company developed its first pipeline and refinery in Sumatra in 1892, tapping the local oil fields, And after 1896, they had a new leader in Henry W.A. Detterding. At that point, they began the construction of tankers and storage facilities and the creation of a sales organization. In 1902, Marcus Samuel became the Lord Mayor of London, and subsequently in 1903, Royal Dutch Petroleum and Shell made their first move towards a merger by integrating their distribution and sales operations in the Far East and the East Indies. And by 1907, with Marcus Samuel more in politics and having made some poor decisions from a business perspective, the merger of Royal Dutch Petroleum and Shell was complete with a 60-40 stake between Royal Dutch Petroleum and Shell. And as a result, the new company was Royal Dutch Shell. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the aggressive competitive practices of Standard Oil had caught the attention of a lot of legislators, and this led to the passage by the US Congress of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Subsequently, in 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court held that Standard Oil was a monopoly and in violation of Ohio law, but Rockefeller was able to evade this decision by dissolving the Standard Oil Trust and transferring to various companies across various states. But by now, Standard Oil was under public scrutiny, and an American journalist, Ida Tarbell, whose father herself had been impacted by Standard's monopolistic policies, wrote a 19-part expose called The History of the Standard Oil Company, which was released in installments by McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904. And subsequently, in 1911, the US Supreme Court declared Standard Oil in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and therefore illegal, and Standard Oil was ordered to divest all its 33 companies. So companies that you now know as Chevron, Mobil, Amoco, etc., these were all once part of the Standard Oil umbrella. Now, this divestiture of Standard Oil around 1911 was great news for Royal Dutch Shell, which has just entered the US market. Now, we are in the 20th century, and Standard Oil has broken up into its 33 companies. Royal Dutch Shell has become huge. Russia is still the largest producer of oil in the world. And around this time, Edison's light bulb makes its presence felt. And it is possible that the entire oil industry, which is banking on kerosene, may come to an end. And to make matters worse, electric vehicles are also gaining steam. By 1900, about 28% of all cars produced in the US were electric. And this total kept increasing till it peaked in around 1912. But then came an invention that would change the petroleum industry for the next century: the internal combustion engine. And suddenly, a new petroleum byproduct, gasoline, became super important, and gas-powered cars became significantly cheaper than the electric cars. And the man pioneering the mass production of internal combustion engines for these gas-powered cars was Henry Ford. So far, the core oil-producing centers globally have been Russia, the Dutch East Indies, and the United States. And then, in 1908, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company strikes oil in Iran, making it the first oil discovery in the Middle East. So now the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC, was looking for a big buyer for its oil, and Coincidentally, around that time, Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, or the head of the Royal Navy, was looking for a 3-year expansion program and modernizing the British Royal Navy by abandoning the use of coal-fired steamships and adopting oil as the fuel for these ships, because he felt the oil would make them go on a longer range and be faster, giving them significant advantage over the enemy. And Churchill wants to avoid reliance on Standard Oil or a Royal Dutch Shell, and since APOC managers approach him, he ends up buying a 51% stake in APOC. And then in 1914, World War I breaks out. Initially, the Germans are thinking of ending the war fairly quickly because they know they have the advantage of their railways and moving their troops fast. But there's a big variable that suddenly appears. It's still the mobility of troops, but the means have changed drastically, from trucks, tanks, warplanes, and the Navy. And all of these are using petroleum byproducts like gasoline. And these have a significant edge over the coal-powered rail infrastructure of Germany. And coincidentally, Standard Oil of New Jersey and Royal Dutch Shell end up being the majority suppliers of oil to the Allies during World War I. And with the victory of the Allies in World War I, the importance of oil as a strategic national asset came to the fore. Now it was clear all the benefits that petroleum offered, and in comparison to coal, it could be utilized in vehicles and ships, and it could be transported with ease and used in different kind of vehicles. So it was very clear that there was a clear strategic advantage of having access or ownership of petroleum. So what role did petroleum play post World War I and during World War II? That I'll cover in the next episode. Moving on to the quiz section. The question from the previous episode: which one has been the most effective vaccine of all time? Is it A, the smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner in 1796, B, the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk in 1955, C, the MMR vaccine combined by Maurice Hillman in 1971, or D, the typhoid vaccine by Edward Wright in 1896. The last natural outbreak of smallpox in the United States occurred in 1949, and by 1980, the WHO had declared smallpox eradicated, and that makes smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner in 1796 the most effective vaccine of all time. So the answer is A, the smallpox vaccine. On to the question for this episode. Looking at the antitrust cases from the 20th century, Standard Oil case being the first, which was the second company after Standard Oil to undergo an antitrust ruling. Was it A, Kodak, B, AT&T, C, Microsoft, or D, Google? Once again, looking at the antitrust cases from the 20th century, which was the second company after Standard Oil to undergo an antitrust ruling? A, Kodak, B, AT&T, C, Microsoft, or D, Google? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all I have for this episode. I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks with part 2 of this series on the history of petroleum towards becoming the most important economic and strategic asset of the 20th century. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.